My name is Claire Hendricks. I'm 43 years old. And the day I finally stopped being invisible to my family was the same day I realized I had been disappearing, slowly, quietly, willingly, for most of my life. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it the way you say something true that took you too long to see. Like standing in a room with no windows and then someone opens a door and you realize the darkness wasn't normal. You had just stopped expecting light. That door opened on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. I was standing in my beach house, my house, the one I had worked 12 years to buy, holding a glass of water, watching the ocean through the large front window. The light was doing something beautiful on the water, that pale gold color that only happens in autumn, when the sun sits lower in the sky and everything it touches looks a little softer, a little more honest. I had been in that house for exactly 6 hours. I hadn't even unpacked my second bag yet. And then my phone rang. I saw my mother's name on the screen, and I felt the warmth I always feel when I see it. That complicated, layered warmth that comes from loving someone who has not always known how to love you back. I answered on the second ring. Mom. Hi? Claire. Her voice was bright, organized, the voice she uses when she has already made a decision. Good. I'm glad I caught you. I wanted to let you know that your father and I have been talking, and we've decided we're going to move into the beach house. I said nothing. The ocean kept moving outside the window. Derek suggested it, she continued. He said the house is large enough, and with your father's health the way it is, being near the water would be good for him. We talked it over at dinner last week, and everyone agreed it makes the most sense. Dinner last week. I had not been at any dinner last week. We thought the east bedroom for us, and the smaller room could stay as a guest room. You'd still be welcome to visit, of course. There it was. Visit. My home. And I would be welcome to visit. I don't know how long the silence lasted. Long enough for my mother to say, Claire, are you still there? Yes, I said. I'm here. Good. I knew you'd understand. You've always been practical about these things. I told her I would call her back. I set the phone on the windowsill. I picked up my glass of water and I looked at the ocean and I breathed very slowly. The water was still doing that beautiful thing with the light. Nothing outside had changed, but something inside me had shifted. Not loudly, not violently, the way tectonic plates move, imperceptibly, and then, all at once. I stood there for a long time, and the thought that came to me was not rage. It was something quieter and much more final. I thought, this is not the first time they decided my life without me, but it will be the last. Have you ever had a moment like that? Where you didn't cry, didn't shout, just went very still and knew, deep in the part of you that doesn't lie, that something had permanently changed? Tell me in the comments, because what happened next began a long time before that phone call. It began at the very beginning. My parents' names are Margaret and Frank Hendricks. They are not cruel people. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about monsters. It is a story about ordinary people, ordinary patterns, and the ordinary damage that quiet favoritism does over a lifetime. My father grew up the third son in a family with very little money and a great deal of pride. His mother had told him, plainly, that sons carried the family name and daughters married into someone else's. That belief settled inside him the way beliefs do when you hear them young, not as opinion, but as fact. He never said it out loud to me. He didn't need to. You could feel it in the way he looked at my brother Derek, the way his face changed. My mother was the eldest daughter in her family, which meant she was raised to be useful. She cooked by age 9. She managed the household by 12. She was never asked what she wanted to be. She was simply told what she was needed for. I think she believed, honestly, that she was preparing me for the world by doing the same thing to me. I think she thought reliability was the greatest gift she could give a daughter. I was born first. Derek came 5 years later. The difference between how we were raised was not something you could point to on any single day. It was in the accumulation of small things. Derek got the larger portion at dinner. It was just how it was served. Derek's school play, the one where he played a talking tree and forgot half his lines. Both of my parents were in the front row. For my school production, only my aunt came. My parents had something else that evening. I don't remember what. I remember sitting in the car with my aunt afterward and her saying, "You were wonderful, sweetheart," and meaning it completely, and it still not being enough. When Derek wanted to quit piano at age 8, my mother said that was fine. Some children weren't musical. When I asked at age 9 if I could stop taking the lessons I had never asked to start, I was told I needed to follow through on my commitments. My family was not wealthy. Money was a source of stress and sometimes shame. I learned early that asking for things was a burden. So I stopped asking. I started contributing instead. I made myself useful. I cooked dinners when my parents worked late. I helped Derek with his homework. I cleaned the kitchen without being told. And every time I did these things, I was praised. "Claire is so responsible," the aunts would say at family gatherings. "Claire is so mature for her age." I thought that was love. I thought being needed was the same as being wanted. Our extended family was close and warm in the way that large families sometimes are, full of noise and shared meals and opinions about everyone's business. And within that network, Derek was adored. He was funny and charming and easy. People lit up around him. I was respected, acknowledged from a comfortable distance, the dependable one, the one you called when something needed to be organized or a problem needed solving. When I was 18, I applied for a partial scholarship to a university 3 hours from home. I applied alone. I filled out every form myself, wrote my own essays, researched the deadlines. When I was accepted, my mother said, "That's good, Claire." My father nodded. There was no celebration, no dinner, no cake, no photograph. I packed my own bags 2 weeks later, and my father drove me to the bus station and said, "Be careful." I watched the bus pull away from that town, and I told myself I was proud, and I was. But I was also, beneath the pride, very quietly alone. I want you to understand something before we go further. I'm not telling you this story to earn your sympathy. I'm telling it because so many of us have lived inside these invisible structures, families where love is distributed unevenly, where certain children are held close and others are held at arm's length. And we have called it normal because it was all we knew. Maybe you know exactly what I'm describing. If you do, stay with me. Because this story doesn't end in the past. It ends somewhere much better. My 20s were, in most outward ways, a success. I graduated. I found work in healthcare administration, a field that suited my particular combination of organization, patience, and the ability to manage difficult situations without losing composure. I was good at my job. My supervisors trusted me. I received promotions. I built a life. But the pull of the family never let go. Derek enrolled in college 2 years after I graduated. He lasted 1 semester. The family paid for it without complaint. He enrolled again at a different school the following year. He lasted a little longer that time. The family paid again. When I asked my mother gently whether Derek had a plan, she said, "He's still figuring himself out." I had been 18 when I figured myself out, alone, on a bus. But I said nothing. I had started sending money home by then. Small amounts at first. My parents had a difficult month. The car needed repairs. The heating system failed. I sent what I could. And then the amounts grew, and the months became more frequent, and somewhere along the way, it stopped being an emergency and became a structure. I was the structure. I had been the structure my entire life. I had just started doing it with a bank transfer instead of a broom. Derek got married when he was 26. His wife, Natalie, was pleasant and quiet. The family threw a large celebration, a proper reception dinner with a hired venue and flowers and a photographer. I was asked, 3 weeks before the wedding, to help organize the catering and to contribute financially toward it. I said yes to both. I spent 4 weekends making calls and coordinating vendors, and I wrote a check for $800 that no one thanked me for. 6 months after Derek's wedding, my parents gave him and Natalie a check for $12,000 as a contribution toward the down payment on their first apartment. I did not know they had that money. I had been sending money home for years because I believed they did not have enough. When I found out, by accident, through something Natalie said at a family lunch, I went to my mother that evening and asked her about it. She looked at me with complete calm and said, "Derek needed it more." That was the whole sentence. Derek needed it more. No explanation of why. No acknowledgement of what I had been giving. No comparison. Just that sentence, offered as though it were obvious, as though my question itself were slightly unreasonable. I drove home that evening and I sat in my apartment and I was so quiet inside that it frightened me a little. Not because I was about to break, but because I understood, fully and clearly for perhaps the first time, what was happening. And I didn't know what to do with that understanding. The moment that stays with me most clearly from those years came on my 32nd birthday. I woke up that Saturday and checked my phone. Nothing from my parents. I told myself they were probably busy. By evening, still nothing. I called my mother. She didn't answer. I left a message. She called back 2 days later, cheerful and distracted, and said she had been at Derek's for the weekend. He'd had a little barbecue. Very last minute. Very casual. She didn't mention my birthday. I didn't either. That night, I wrote in my journal. I still have the entry. It says, "I am 32 years old and my parents forgot my birthday because they were at my brother's house. I don't think they forgot on purpose. I think they just didn't think of me, and I'm not sure which one hurts more." That's all it says. No dramatic conclusion. Just a woman sitting at her kitchen table at 32, writing the truth for the first time. It was after that birthday that I made a decision. Not a loud decision. A quiet one. I was going to save money. Seriously, deliberately, without telling anyone. For a home of my own. Not just any home. A house near water. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one had any claim to. Somewhere entirely mine. I didn't know it would take 12 years, but I started the next morning. If you've ever saved for something in secret, something that felt too personal to explain to anyone else, you understand what that felt like. It was a private act of self-preservation. It was the first thing I had ever done purely for myself. Over the 8 years that followed, I kept 2 accounts running in parallel. One was for my family. One was for my house. I paid for my father's back surgery in 2017. The insurance covered most of it, but there was a gap. $4,200 that wasn't covered. My father was in pain and my mother was frightened and I had the money and they were my parents. I transferred it without being asked twice. My father said, "I'll pay you back." He never did. I never reminded him. In 2018, my father lost his job for 5 months. I covered 3 months of my parents' mortgage payments, $940 a month, and I transferred it on the first of each month, quietly, without making it into a conversation. Because making it into a conversation would have made my father feel ashamed and my mother feel defensive. And neither of those outcomes served anyone. Derek went through what the family called a rough stretch in 2019. His work situation was uncertain and he and Natalie had 2 children by then. I agreed to cover his car insurance for 2 years. That was about $1,100 per year. I also bought my mother a new refrigerator when hers broke. $680. I bought her a plane ticket to visit her sister who was sick. $340. I bought Derek's children winter coats 2 years running because Natalie mentioned, in passing, that they were getting expensive. I kept no formal record. And it never felt like a ledger. It felt like love, or at least like the version of love I had been taught. The version where you show up, you provide, you don't make a fuss. And I drove a car that was 11 years old. I drove a car that was 11 years old and rattled in cold weather. I packed my lunch every single day. I did not take vacations. I wore the same coat for 6 winters. I didn't resent any of it because every month I also transferred a smaller, steadier amount into my other account, the house account. And watching that number grow was the quietest, most private joy of my adult life. My friend Ruth, we worked together in the same department, and she was 10 years older than me and had the kind of warm, no-nonsense wisdom that only comes from having survived a few things. Ruth noticed how I lived. She asked me once, at lunch, why I never spent money on anything nice for myself. I laughed and said I was saving for something. "What are you saving for?" she asked. "A house near water," I said. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere entirely mine." She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Good. Just that. Good." As though she already understood everything behind the answer. In September of last year, I signed the final documents on the beach house. It was a 2-bedroom house 40 minutes from the coast, modest in size, well built, with large windows that faced the water. The signing took 20 minutes. I sat alone at a table in an office that smelled of printer toner and carpet cleaner, and I wrote my name in 9 places, and when the agent handed me the keys, I held them in both hands for a moment before I put them in my pocket. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat. And I cried. Not because I was sad, not because I was thinking about everything I had given up to get there. I cried because of the specific, overwhelming feeling of having completed something entirely, completely, 100% for myself, for the first time in my adult life. I took a photo of the keys sitting in my palm. I looked at my phone and thought about who to send it to. And then I put the phone away and just sat there, by myself, with the keys to my own house. And that felt exactly right. That was 3 weeks before the phone call. When I replayed my mother's words that first evening, I kept returning to one phrase. She had said, "Everyone agreed. Everyone." There had been a dinner, a family dinner I was not invited to or informed about, where my mother's plan to move into my house had been discussed and approved, by everyone except me. I was not in the room. I was not consulted. I was simply informed afterward, the way you inform someone about a schedule change. I spent 2 days in the beach house alone after that call. I walked along the water in the mornings. I cooked simple meals. I thought. I was not dramatic about it. I just needed to understand what had happened before I reacted to it. On the 3rd day, I called Derek. He answered quickly, which I appreciated. I told him I had spoken to Mom and I wanted to understand his thinking. He was quiet for a moment and then he shifted into the tone he uses when he believes he is being reasonable, but is actually being, would be good for them. "Derek," I said, "would be good for them." "Derek," I said, "that house is mine. I know it's yours, but you're practical. You've always been practical. You can see why this makes sense. You're practical." He said it like a compliment. He always said it like a compliment. What he meant was, you'll adjust. You always adjust. That's what you do. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't say, "I know this is a big ask." He spoke about my house the way you speak about a piece of furniture that needs to be rearranged. as though my ownership of it was a formality, not a fact. I said I needed to think. I hung up. I called my mother the following morning. She answered with the same calm authority she had used the first time. She had clearly not anticipated that I would push back. She mentioned which bedroom she and my father had decided to take. She said she'd already spoken to Aunt Patricia about it. She described the east-facing bedroom as ideal for the morning light. I said quietly, "Mom, I haven't agreed to this." There was a pause. Then she said, "You've always been difficult to reach emotionally, Claire. We thought you'd understand." Difficult to reach emotionally. I am a person who sent money home for 8 years. I paid for my father's surgery. I covered their mortgage. I spent 4 weekends organizing my brother's wedding catering. I was difficult to reach emotionally. I told her I needed time. I hung up. I sat on the floor of my living room, the floor of my house, and I pressed my hand flat against the hardwood and felt how solid it was. That evening, Ruth called to check on me. I told her everything. Not in pieces. All of it. And for the first time, I said the words out loud. They did it again. They just took something that was mine and decided it belonged to everyone. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet. But this time I'm going to decide. Me. On my own terms." She said, "Good. Then let's think." Ruth and I met for coffee 2 days later. She brought nothing with her except herself, which was enough. She is not a dramatic person. She doesn't offer revenge plans or tell you what you should feel. She asks questions. And the questions are always the ones you have been avoiding. She sat across from me with her coffee, and she said, "What do you actually want, Claire? Not what is fair, not what they deserve. What do you want your life to look like from this point forward?" I was quiet for a long time. I said, "I want peace. I want to keep my house. I want them to understand what they've done, not through a fight, but through clarity. And I want to stop being the person who absorbs everything and says nothing." Ruth nodded. "All of that is possible," she said. "But you need to stop managing it privately." She was right. I had always managed things privately. That was my entire strategy. Absorb, adapt, be practical, say nothing. The problem with that strategy is that it had taught my family that there were no consequences, that they could reach into my life and rearrange it, and I would quietly rearrange myself to accommodate. I had trained them to do this. Not intentionally, but I had done it. Ruth suggested I document the financial history. Not as a legal weapon, not to send to anyone, just for myself, so that the truth had a shape I could see clearly. I spent 3 evenings doing that. I went through old bank statements, old email records, the notes I kept in a small notebook I'd had for years. I wrote down every significant contribution: the surgery, the mortgage payments, the wedding catering, the car insurance, the refrigerator, the plane tickets, the coats. When I added it up, the number was over $62,000 across 12 years. My down payment on the beach house had been $58,000. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at those two numbers for a long time. I had given my family more than I had spent on myself, and they had looked at my house and seen a resource to claim. This is not a weapon, I told myself. This is just the truth, finally made visible. Then Ruth mentioned the upcoming birthday lunch for my Aunt Helen. It was scheduled for the following Saturday, at a restaurant that could fit the whole extended family. Nearly everyone would be there. My parents, Derek and Natalie, aunts, uncles, family friends. A full table. Ruth said, "That is where you speak. Not to attack, not to shame. To be clearly, publicly, and permanently heard." I understood what she was saying. I had spoken privately to Derek, and it changed nothing. I had spoken privately to my mother, and it changed nothing. Privacy had always protected the family's version of events. What they needed was witnesses. I said, "I'll do it." I didn't prepare a speech. I prepared something more important: clarity. I thought carefully about what I wanted to say and what I wanted the outcome to be. Not revenge, not punishment, truth, and a line. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early on Saturday. I wore something simple and clean: dark trousers, a blue blouse, flat shoes. I carried a small folder with nothing in it except my printed financial document. I didn't plan to hand it out like a report. It was just for me, a quiet anchor. Ruth was not with me. This was my moment, and I wanted to face it alone. The lunch was warm and ordinary at first. 12 people around a long table, bread in a basket, someone's child drawing on a paper napkin, and my Aunt Helen opening a card and laughing. Normal, beautiful even. These were the people I had grown up beside. I loved them. That hadn't changed. The food came. People talked. My father asked about the weather further south. Derek told a story about something his older child had said that made everyone laugh. I ate my soup, and I waited. Then, in the quiet between the main course being cleared and the dessert being offered, my mother looked around the table with an easy smile and said, "I don't think I've told everyone yet. Frank and I are planning to spend our summers at Claire's beach house. Isn't that lovely? We're so looking forward to it." A few people smiled. My Aunt Patricia said, "Oh, how wonderful." Someone else asked if there was a good guest room. I set down my fork. The sound of it touching the plate was small. But something in my stillness must have been visible, because the conversation paused very slightly. "I need to say something," I said, "before we go any further with that." The table quieted. My mother looked at me with a careful expression, the one she uses when she thinks a situation needs to be managed. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at the folder. I just spoke. "I want to give everyone at this table some context," I said, "because I think you've been hearing part of a story, and you deserve the whole thing." I described what I had contributed to this family over 12 years. I did not make it sound like an accusation. I made it sound like what it was: a series of choices I had made out of love. I mentioned my father's surgery, the $4,000 gap I had covered without being asked twice. I mentioned the 3 months of mortgage payments in 2018. I mentioned Derek's car insurance for 2 years, the wedding catering, the refrigerator, the plane ticket for my mother's sister, the children's winter coats. The table was very quiet. My father was looking at the tablecloth. Derek was looking at his water glass. Natalie was looking at Derek. "I'm not saying these things to make anyone feel guilty," I said. "I'm saying them because my mother has announced a plan regarding my home to this table, and that plan has never been agreed to by me. So I want you all to understand the full picture before we continue." Then I said, "This house is mine. I bought it alone. No one helped me. I have not agreed to share it or give it up, and I will not." The silence was complete. My mother drew a breath to speak. I looked at her gently and said, "I'm not finished." She closed her mouth. "Going forward," I said, "I will not be participating in decisions about my life that are made without me, and I will not be contributing financially to the family from this point on. Not because I don't love you, but because I have been giving without limit for a very long time, and I am choosing now to give to myself." I looked around the table, at my Aunt Helen, who had come to my school play when no one else had, at my Aunt Patricia, who looked stunned, at the family friends who were very still, at my brother who was not looking at me, at my father, who finally looked up and met my eyes for just a moment. "I love this family," I said, "but I will not disappear inside it." I picked up my fork and I finished my meal. And the table, slowly, carefully resumed. The drive home from that lunch was the quietest drive of my life, not because I was numb, because I was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely at peace. The days that followed were uncomfortable in the way that any honest reckoning is uncomfortable. That evening, Derek sent me a long message. I read it once. It was a complicated thing. Part apology, part justification, cycling between, I didn't know it was this serious, and I still think you could have handled this privately. I didn't respond that night. I let it sit. My mother called once the following morning and once that afternoon. I let both calls go to voicemail. The first message was hurt and slightly indignant. The second was quieter, more careful. I answered on the third call, 2 days later. She didn't apologize directly. My mother rarely does. Not meant to exclude me, that it had all not meant to exclude me, that it had all come up very casually. I listened without arguing. I didn't try to convince her of anything. At the end of the call, I said, "Mom, I'm not angry, but things are going to be different now, and I need you to understand that." She said, "I hear you." It wasn't a full reckoning, but it was more than I had ever received before. My Aunt Helen called me a few days after the lunch. She is my mother's older sister, and she has always been, quietly, in my corner. She said, "I had no idea, Claire, about any of it. You never said." I told her I didn't think anyone would hear. She said, "I would've. I always would've." That conversation stayed with me for days, the loneliness of having kept so much to myself for so long, not because no one cared, but because I had stopped believing that saying things out loud would change anything. Several other relatives texted after the lunch. Some said they had always admired me. One cousin said she had experienced something similar in her own family, and that watching me speak the way I had was something she would not forget. These messages were small things, but they mattered. Derek's response evolved slowly over the following 2 weeks. The long justifying message was followed by a shorter one, then a brief call, where he sounded tired and a little humbled. He said he hadn't thought about it from my perspective. I told him I believed him. And I also told him that wasn't an excuse, that choosing not to think about someone's perspective is also a choice. He was quiet after that. 3 weeks after the lunch, I received a letter from my father. Handwritten. 3 paragraphs on pale blue paper in his careful, slightly slanted script. He did not apologize for the beach house plan. That was not how my father operated, and I had long since stopped expecting it. But he said he was proud of me. He said he had watched me build a life with nothing but my own effort, and he knew it hadn't been easy. He said he hoped I would always know that he saw that, even when he hadn't said so. It was incomplete. As accountability goes, it left a great deal out. But I know my father. I know his limits. I know the specific emotional architecture of a man who was taught that strength meant silence, in that praise was weakness, that asking for forgiveness was something you did only in church. 3 paragraphs was the most he had ever given me. I folded the letter carefully and I put it in the drawer of my bedside table, and I cried a little. Not with anger, with the particular grief of loving someone for exactly who they are, rather than who you needed them to be. The power shift that happened after that lunch was not dramatic. My family did not transform. My parents did not suddenly become different people. Derek did not have an overnight revelation, but something had changed irrevocably in the invisible structure of how the family operated. The unspoken rule that Claire could be used without consequence, that her needs were always secondary, that her resources were family resources, had been named out loud in front of witnesses. Kin, and that naming could not be undone. My mother calls me once a month now. The conversations are shorter than they used to be, and more honest. She no longer volunteers my resources for family plans. She no longer makes announcements about my life. We talk about small things: her garden, her television programs, how my father's back is doing. It is not the deep, warm closeness I used to wish for, but it is real, and it is honest. And I have made my peace with accepting what my mother is capable of giving, rather than grieving what she cannot. I am at the beach house now as I tell you this story. It is early morning. The light is low and clean, and the water is very still. I have been coming here every month since the lunch. Sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for longer. I started seeing a therapist in November. Not because I am broken, and because I wanted help understanding myself better and building the kind of life I actually want rather than the one I fell into by default. Therapy has given me language for things I had always felt but never fully understood. The way I had conflated being useful with being loved. The way I had made myself indispensable because invisibility felt safer than asking for something and being refused. The way I had given and given and given, not only because I was asked to, but because giving felt like the only thing I knew how to do that was guaranteed to matter. That understanding doesn't undo the past, but it changes the future. Derek and his family visited the beach house once, in January. It was civil, quiet. He brought the children, who were delighted by the water and ran along the shore in the cold with complete disregard for the temperature. I stood on the porch and watched them and thought, this is enough. Not everything I wished for, but enough. I'm not going to tell you that I have arrived at a place of complete forgiveness. That would not be honest. What I have arrived at is something more useful: understanding. I understand my parents' limitations. I understand the culture and history that shaped them. I understand that they did not set out to diminish me. They simply did not see me as fully as they saw Derek, and they never questioned that imbalance because it served them not to. Understanding that does not make it hurt less. It makes it possible to stop carrying the hurt as the central fact of my life. What I have also arrived at is this: I know who I am now. I am a woman who built something entirely with her own hands, her own savings, her own years of careful and unglamorous effort. I am a woman who spoke the truth in a room full of people and did not shatter. I am a woman who has a house near water, with good light and morning quiet, and a drawer that holds a letter from her father that says, imperfectly, that he sees her. I spent years making myself small enough to fit into the space my family allowed me. I thought that was love. I believed that keeping the peace, absorbing the hurt, being the practical one, the responsible one, the one who never made a fuss. I believed that was how you held a family together. What I know now is this: real love has room in it. Room for your name to be said at a dinner. A room for your birthday to be remembered. Room for someone to ask before making a plan whether you are willing and able and present. Real love does not require you to become smaller and smaller until there is almost nothing left of you. And the love you give to yourself, the kind you build in quiet years with packed lunches and old cars and a savings account you protect like something sacred. That love is not selfish. It is necessary. It is, in the end, the only foundation that holds. I want to ask you something before we close. Have you ever given too much to people who gave too little back? Have you ever been the responsible one, the practical one, the one who managed everything and was thanked for almost nothing? If you have, I want you to know something. It is not too late. The line you have not yet drawn can still be drawn. Each the thing you have not yet said can still be said. Quietly, firmly, without cruelty, without performance, just truth. Spoken clearly, in front of whoever needs to hear it. This house is mine, and so, finally, am I. If this story moved you in any way, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and tell me in the comments, What was the moment you decided to stop disappearing? I read every single one.